a couple of, I'd like to introduce at this time, we have Eric Rigo, who is representing the Center for Civic Action, and James Jimenez, he is the Executive Director for New Mexico Voices for Children Action Fund. And I want to say just a couple of ground rules for this forum that we're going to have. For the candidates focus, the focus of this forum is on early childhood and K through 12 constitutional amendment, which is going to be on the November ballot. We're asking that you, the candidates, focus your responses on the issue rather than on stump speeches. This forum is for voters to get to know you, the candidates. So focus on your strengths, on your qualifications, on your ideas, and please avoid disrespecting other candidates. Make sure that you are answering the questions that are being asked, and each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to each round of the questions. And then after the 2 rounds of questions from the moderators, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And we ask the audience that you focus your questions on this issue as well. And so put your questions as you think of them in the chat, and we'll be looking at them and getting them together to ask the candidates, and then the candidates will have 1 minute to answer those questions. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Riego Montoya and James Jimenez.
Thank you, Flora, and thanks to all the candidates. James and I are gonna do a quick just overview, because we assume that you all are paying attention, and I'm sure you're knowledgeable, but we want to make sure for folks joining us who maybe haven't been in the weeds on this issue, that they at least know the basics. So I'm gonna go ahead and James and I are gonna tag him a quick presentation here, and I'm gonna let James kick it off, since he's just newly off of the leading group on this, New Mexico Voices for Children, and now he's with the Action Fund. So James, I'll be your slide changer, and maybe you can kick it off, and I'll jump in as you need me. So
great, thank you, Eric. Let's go ahead and get to the first one. As Madam Chair noted at the beginning of our meeting this evening, that this is something that New Mexico Voices for Children, and Eric in particular, when he was executive director at New Mexico Voices for Children, came up with the idea of how do we provide long-term dedicated funding for early childhood education programs. As we might remember, 12 years ago, New Mexico was in a very bad place. We had a governor who clearly demonstrated that she did not care about early childhood education, or very many other things that were important to us. Eric and the staff came up with this idea to direct a small portion of the Land Grant Permanent Fund to dedicate that to early childhood education. The HJR 1, the legislation that was passed, will increase the withdrawal amount by 1.25%, with 0.75% going to early childhood education and 0.5% to K-12. Because, of course, it went through a legislative process, there were some compromises that were made and some safeguards that were put in to ensure that we wouldn't, in fact, be draining the fund like some conservatives claim that we wanted to do. So there would be a break on it should the fund ever shrink below $17 billion. Why do we need it? Well, I think we as Democrats understand why we need it, right? I mean, our children are the most important asset that we have in our state, but you can't prove that really by many of our rankings. And this is why we need to use these dedicated funds to invest in our children. But we know that nearly 30% of New Mexico's children younger than 5 live in poverty. 42% of all working families with children are low income. We could cite the statistics over and over again. We know that New Mexico is ranked 49th in child well-being. And one of the ways that we change that is by investing in children at the very early stages, providing families the support that they need. One of the things that has really changed since I was a young parent is how much it costs to provide early care and education programs to our children. this slide is really stunning in that it indicates that single parents spend 41% of their income on childcare. Now think about that. That is a horrific figure, given that we know that at the same time they're trying to pay for quality childcare so they can work or go to school and provide for their families, they're also having to pay rent, their fuel costs. All of the things that go into raising a family are continuing to be higher. And that one of the things that we can do as a state is provide more support for these families. And we know the poverty rate for early educators in New Mexico is 27%, which is 2 times higher than workers in general. So we're not really investing not only in the families, but we're not investing in the workforce either. Now, why is this amount important? And what we're talking about is a gap of about $400 million is necessary. We know that there's not enough licensed childcare slots for families right now. That the unmet need for early child care and services would require, as I said, more than $400 million for New Mexico. Eric, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So these are a lot of numbers, I know, and those of you who've been really active on this, I get it, but especially we're going to hear from candidates, especially for treasurer, which, you know, they play a huge role in this, and auditor candidates who also want to make sure that we spend this wisely. We'll be asking about that. But as some of you know, this fund, when we started, was about in the $12 billion range. It's more than doubled since we started this whole conversation 12 years ago. The HCR 1 has passed, would raise about $150 million for early childhood and about $100 million for K-12 using the current 5-year rolling average. And I know maybe our treasurer candidates may want to elaborate a little bit on that. So it's a big amount of money. We want to make sure it's spent wisely and that it has impact. But we're here, James and I are here in the effort that we're doing along with the Ole and a few other partners like Working Families, is to talk to Democrats. There's a big coalition, I think, that has been mentioned that's really just trying to educate voters overall and make sure they show up in November and support this. What we're trying to do, and the reason why we're here and why we're so appreciative of Flora letting us do this, is Democrats have to drive this. And it has to be an issue now in the next 2 weeks. And as we close out the primary, we have to know that our party leaders from the top of the ticket all the way down to local offices are saying this encapsulates our core democratic values, and it has to be an issue in primary. So as you all close out your closing arguments in the next couple of weeks, we hope this will be one of them. We really believe it's a contrast issue. In the general, it's going to get crazy. We've already seen some of the ads and some of the debate on the other side, that we have to unapologetically say this is what we stand for, and that we really believe, and we have some polling to back this up, that this is a contrast issue. It's not just about all the other hot button issues. This is an issue of really where we see the state going and the children of the state going. So the way we're going to win is to really make it a contrast issue, and we've of course need to turn out lots of voters so we keep the state blue, but also we get this passed. So how can you help? I hope that each of you who are running, and if you're a party official or if you're just an activist, that you endorse the campaign and that you become an outspoken supporter. We're willing to provide you any backup you need in terms of really making the case if you don't feel comfortable. Hopefully this helped you get a little more comfortable, but there's a lot of information out there that's really helping make the case. Again, for the candidates, we hope that, and for the party, we've already passed a resolution, so it's not in the party core platform, but it is a resolution in support of this. But we hope that all of you who are running will really make this part of your platform publicly, including on your websites if you can. And then finally, we want you to do what we're doing here, not just in the primary, but in the general, is to ask every candidate who's asking for your vote or asking for your endorsement or asking for your money, like, where are you on the issue? And we're going to ask all of you tonight to just publicly commit your support. We're assuming you're all supportive, but we want to hear it from your lips. So those are all things that we can do as Democrats and as all the candidates here to really make sure this is successful. So if you want to get more involved, please reach out to centerforcivicaction.com. There's a little more information there. NewMexicoVoices.org has tons of research on this. They've been looking at it for years. If you want to contact either Andres Serrano at Ole, who's been helping with this, or James Jimenez, their emails are there. Please reach out to them, and we just appreciate you all focusing on this important issue as we go forward, and Flora for letting us do this. So I think we're going to go to now that we hopefully have a level set that everybody at least has some good information on it. We want to go to questions. So Flora, you want to, I think, should we just jump right into questions?
Yeah, we're going to start with the Attorney General's candidates, and I believe Mr. Jimenez is going to be asking this question, and it starts with Brian Colon.
All right. Thank you very much. And you'll have 2 minutes each for this. And the first question is, please state whether you support the early childhood and education ballot measure on the November ballot. If not, why? And if so, how the office you're seeking would work to ensure its success. Brian?
Thank you, James. We just had a forum over at Drinking Liberally tonight, and so I'm rolling up on the house to get to my computer screen. But let me just say I emphatically support this constitutional amendment. I remember years ago standing with educators to support the Yes on 1 and 2 constitutional amendment so we could better fund and begin to fund education in an appropriate way. I think that as Attorney General, we're going to look forward to pushing back on any kind of challenges to this constitutional amendment that may come up. And as you mentioned earlier, this does have the potential to become a divisive issue if the Republicans decide to take this up. I will tell you that, and I think your polling shows that by and large, New Mexicans believe this is the right approach. We even know that even though this was kind of a moonshot of a constitutional amendment to properly fund early childhood care and education, whether it be child care or the other standards that are going to be implemented, and that includes training for early childhood education professionals that we don't talk about enough, because I think that whether you're Democrat or Republican, we believe that education professionals are in need in New Mexico, and then we have to grow our own in order to make that work. So I emphatically, without hesitation, support this constitutional amendment. I look forward to standing with the executive once this passes in implementation, and then making sure we defend this in years to come. It is absolutely and financially very sound with some important safeguards, and it's the right thing to do. It's the best investment. They talk about planting seeds for trees that generations to come will provide shade for those generations. That's exactly what we've done here. And for once, we've had a leader that understands it takes a long-term investment to have outstanding outcomes, and that's exactly what this constitutional amendment does.
Thank you, Brian. And Raul?
Hi, Mr. Jimenez. This constitutional amendment is long overdue, and I wholeheartedly support it. One of the things that comes up in my role as district attorney is a conversation about crime and root causes. And from my perspective, I think a lot of what we see inside the criminal justice system today is frankly a reflection of the failure to invest in the most vulnerable families and children in our state 15 and 20 years ago. We have a really difficult challenge in traumatized and destabilized families and adverse childhood experiences. 75% of the boys and 87% of the girls in juvenile detention in Bernalillo County have 5 or more ACEs, meaning they have been the victim of sexual assault, abuse, neglect, housing instability, and incarcerated parent. And we have a moral obligation to do everything in our power to give the resources that are necessary, not only to provide basic quality education early in childhood, but also those extraordinarily important wraparound services. We've worked with a program in my office called the Adobe program that takes some of those juvenile offenders that have been released back into the community. They get enrolled in services for substance abuse and behavioral health support, but also educational support. And it's something that we're actually trying to replicate on the front end. So we actually are partnering with various providers here in the community to try and get the children of incarcerated adults into those critical services so that we can break the cycle of incarceration. Because fundamentally, I think that kind of investment is the most important public safety investment that we could possibly make. So I applaud this effort. I want to thank you for leading the charge, and I stand wholeheartedly in support of this in any way that I can.
Thank you, Raul. Next, we're going to move to our treasurer candidates, and we'll start with Heather Benavides. Heather, would you like for me to repeat the question?
No, not at all. I think that what you asked was, does this have our support? And as the state treasurer, how can we support it if it does pass, right? Did I miss
Correct.
anything? Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. And so, yes, this absolutely unequivocally has my support. As a mother, I know how difficult it was to pay for childcare when my daughter was young. It was very, very expensive. And I know that I think all parents want the best for our children, and we want our children to have the best education they can. We want to make sure that they graduate. We want to make sure that they have hope for the future. And so they don't enter the criminal justice system because, that's where the circumstances of their lives are taking them. And in order to do that, I think that in order to prevent those things, I think that this will be helpful, of course, as all of the documentation tells us and the studies have shown. And I'm also very proud to be endorsed by AFT New Mexico. And I think that I won their endorsement, which I'm very proud of, because I showed such strong support for this. And so the treasurer specifically sits on the State Investment Council, which handles the investments for the Land Grant Permanent Fund. And so it's one member of a council. And what I can do as the state treasurer is support our state investment officer, Steve Moise, and make sure that the investments we're making will be enough to, or smart, so that the fund never drops below the 5-year end of year market value, so that we fall below 17 billion. Because if we do, then the dispersion will discontinue. And so as the state treasurer, I will make sure that we support the investments and that they're prudent and that they are getting a good return, as one person on the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Laura Montoya.
I'm sorry, I just got on.
Oh,
Can you
okay.
tell me?
Sure.
where
Let
we're
me
at
let me
in the
repeat the
agenda?
question
I
for you.
apologize. I'm at Zia Pueblo.
Yeah. Please state whether you support the early childhood care and education ballot measure on the November ballot, and if not, why? And if so, how the office you're seeking would work to ensure its success.
Well, hi, everyone. And how much time do I have, James? Hi to see
Yeah,
you.
2 minutes.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And I'm so happy that you guys decided to talk about this measure. I'm very supportive of it. I think it's been a great idea, and it's a long time coming, and the way that it was crafted was very good because of the fact that it put a minimal cap as well, so that you could never get under the, I believe it's $17 billion. And so that was a safeguard financially that whoever drafted it, is probably James, is really good to safeguard that. The other part that I appreciate is that it's direct services, direct care. And then the third part is that I did wonder why there wasn't a year put on there, because usually in all joint resolutions there is. But I think it's the idea that we always want to continue to invest in our children. And I was also looking at the fiscal impact report, because I was concerned, well, why did they have to get Congress to approve it? But now I understand why, because of the early childhood educational fund aspect of it, prior to 5 years, and then afterwards from K through 12. And so I think that whoever developed it did a really good job in looking at all the different factors. The one thing I would say that would be a little bit concerning is after the 15 years at 2042, it sort of looks on the spreadsheet as like an amortization schedule where it decreases quite significantly. But the idea, I believe, is that you put a lot of money, about 240 million, I think it was, into the fund now, because the kids need it right now, and we've had a big lack for a long time. And so being able to do that, I think sometimes when people look at finances, they don't look at the overall bottom line. They saw that there was the decrease, but they didn't see the aspect of how that benefits us overall on crime and everything else, and parents, single mothers, because their kids can learn all of these things at the most critical time in their lives. So how can the state treasurer's office help with that? There's a factor in there that some of that money, instead of going to the state investment council, it goes into the state treasurer's office. I would be able to make sure that the investment portfolio utilizes all of its assets to have the best earnings with the permissible investments that are allowed. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And we'll move now to our auditor candidates, and we'll start with Joseph Maestas. Joseph, do I need to repeat the question?
No, I think I got it. It's great to be with you. Good to see you, Eric and James. Yes, I support the constitutional amendment wholeheartedly. You know, as a parent and as someone who grew up in a family of public school teachers, as someone who's very familiar with the current status of reading proficiency and the progress of kids here in New Mexico, this is really past due. And so I recall the philosophical debates about the lockbox on the land grant permanent fund. And finally, I think given just the steadfast efforts by all the stakeholders and advocates and people like Eric, the legislature's finally come around to realize that investing in kids, forget about the return on investment, that can't even be quantified, but it's a wise decision. It's got adequate fiscal safeguards with that $17 billion threshold. If the fund falls below that, allocations would diminish. And so, you know, when I was a Santa Fe City Councilor, we tried to pass a sugar tax to fund pre-K in Santa Fe. And we fell short, but it gave us an opportunity to assess the state of early educators and the certification and accreditation of pre-K providers. And so I'm very familiar with this, and I was proud to serve as chairman of New Mexico Voices for Children Board of Directors. So what would I do as state auditor? The early childhood education and care department's a new department. And I think the state auditor needs to get in there to ensure that that new department has the appropriate internal controls to allocate and manage this funding in a accountable and transparent manner. So I thank you for the question. I'm Joe Maestas, and I hope to earn your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And Zach.
Gracias, Mr. Jimenez. Hello, fellow Democrats. Thank you so much, Dr. Griego Montoya. My name is Zachary Quintero, proud son of New Mexico, running to fight for you and our people and our families across New Mexico. I'm fully in support of the amendment. In fact, I'm the only candidate with a designated space for it on my webpage that specifically talks about why we need to invest in it and how we will track it. My idea is straightforward. I want to make sure we have a financial liaison and investment officer between the treasurer's office and the legislature to track this money in real time, to be able to show an annual readout and show and reassure the voters and reassure New Mexicans that our investment is not only sound, but ethically being handled and going to the legally designated spot it needs to go to. That's going to require a tracking system that's advanced, and that's something I've talked about since day one. I'm talking about a federal and state dollar tracking system that is able to point from both bank account, legislature expenditure to community investment in real time, and making it user-friendly rather than a 15,000 PDF page. That's what it's going to take to be able to have that kind of confidence in government, to be able to show what we're doing with our taxpayer money. It's also going to take a huge effort, politically speaking, as well. And that's where I feel I'd be able to offer an even stronger asset as well. I'm the only candidate that's endorsed by Majority Leader Javier Martinez and some of the key sponsors on this legislation. And I'm honored for that endorsement and their trust in my experience that is relevant to the job of being state auditor, but also the tenacity and vision I have as a candidate for state auditor. I've traveled over 14,000 miles in a red Chili Prius, sharing our vision for the state auditor's office, but most importantly, listening to families across New Mexico, listening to families like mine, my mom being a public school teacher and my dad being a plumber. Having a resource and foundation of education early on in our foundation for our education is critical. That's why I'm able to sit here before you on Zoom as a candidate for state auditor and be able to have such a strong record of graduating from both NMSU and UNM School of Law and then applying my legal analytics skills immediately into the executive branch from our governor's administration, who helped build out the early childhood education department. I'll be able to do that for you as state auditor. We deserve details and a plan that works. That's what I'm bringing. Thank you.
Thank you, candidates, for your answers to the question. Eric.
Thank you, James. All right, so we're going to dig a little deeper now. Still get 2 minutes to respond, but let's give you a chance for each of you with respect to the office you're seeking to really kind of drill down a little bit. I think you touched on this a little bit first. So for the AG candidates, we'll start with you. How do each of you think funding a high quality, accessible early childhood education system will affect the state's public safety strategy? As the chief law enforcement official for the state, I think both of you kind of alluded to this, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more. We'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how you as Attorney General think, why is this a good idea, and why should it be part of the public safety strategy, not just something that we think of as education or something else. So we'll start with you, Raul Torres.
Thank you, Eric. I talk a lot of times on the campaign trail about the two bookends that my parents served sort of in my framework for thinking about public service. My dad's a career prosecutor. My mom was a public school teacher. And a lot of times when we have a conversation about crime and public safety, what we're really doing is talking about a continuum of systemic failures and a lack of targeted investments at the highest levels and at the highest risk children. My mom worked in an environment, an institution where she would routinely see people coming into the schools without coats, without food, recognizing that there was something going on in the home. And invariably, when you look at the pre-sentence reports, not just of juvenile offenders, but of adult offenders, you can see an early emerging pattern of neglect and abuse and of lack of targeted funding and resources that have been, that are there, but they're spread so thin that they don't actually get into the homes and get into the households that we need. And it's my hope that in the funding structure of this amendment, once it's actually put into place, that we can have a public safety conversation about the public safety impacts. Because to your point, a lot of times we center the conversation on health and education and child well-being, which are obvious and essential elements of the conversation, but we're missing that component of its impact on public safety. And my experience inside the criminal justice system has taught me that it's easier to build strong children than repair broken men. That's something that Frederick Douglass used to talk about in the middle of the 1800s. And if we put that idea at the center of how we approach our public safety challenges, we would be a stronger community. Because at the end of the day, you want to be in a position where you're not relying on police and prosecutors at the end of a conversation, at the end of somebody's journey or someone's story, but you're relying more on teachers, educators, social workers, and others to go knock on the door when somebody is 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, to make sure that they have access to quality behavioral health assistance, substance abuse disorders. A lot of times we end up enrolling people, not just the juvenile offenders that are released from jail, but also their parents or guardians, to try and stabilize that family. And one of the things that we've seen is the reduction in cost and the lowering of recidivism. The kids that we have in the Adobe program, their recidivism rate is about 20%. The kids that go through the mainline course of the criminal justice system without wraparound services following them out the door, their recidivism rate is closer to 70 or 80%. So it's time for the public safety officials and professionals to start making a public safety argument that you can save lives, you can save money, you can build healthier communities and lower incarceration for future generations, but you have to make a sustained commitment and a sustained investment.
Paul, please put an additional 30 seconds on the clock for Mr. Colon.
Will do.
Thank you. Thank you, Raul. Brian.
Thank you, Eric, for the question, and thanks again for your leadership on this issue. I just want to say that there's no one that's been leaning in longer. I remember our early years together with Lieutenant Governor Diane Dennis when we talked about early childhood development. And now we have expanded that because we understand that it's a broader conversation. It's about early childhood care and education. And I just want to say that I think the beauty of these Unity events is there's not a lot of distance between the candidates on this particular issue. We all understand that it is far more effective to educate children and families instead of incarcerating young people. Let me just applaud the idea in this particular legislation that one of the things my wife deals with on a very regular basis, as she's taught in the international district, the deepest pocket of poverty in Albuquerque for the last 21 years, is that it is very difficult to engage with the children in a way that's supportive when you don't have a sense of their environment at home. And so this particular vision that you've brought and that is on the ballot is one that also includes family visits, I think to the tune of $26 million a year in funding, so that when we talk about wraparound services, we can truly understand what they are. When my wife has a student walk in without any shoes on, she understands what that particular need is. But unless you are doing home visits and truly engaging family in the solution, you're merely putting a Band-Aid on a quick fix set of circumstances. So I just want to say that I've had many conversations about this important investment and how we do break that cycle of the school to prison pipeline. And whether those conversations have been with leaders in the two education unions that have endorsed me, both NEA and AFT have endorsed my campaign for Attorney General, or Majority Leader Javier Martinez, who's endorsed my campaign, they always talk about the root causes of the issues. And it's always about family circumstances. It's about breaking cycles of poverty. It's about having support for those children that have a parent who's incarcerated in their home life. It's working with a public-private partnership like this Constitutional Amendment funds and organizations in our community like Wings International that help mend those broken situations at home. And so we know that from a democratic values point of view, this is the right thing to do. But as we carry this message into our community, it's also the right fiscal thing to do. To invest in these children 0 to 5 is absolutely the best investment we can make for our communities, for economic development, and for the long-term health and safety of our families. Look, we know that when we lay these foundations, we set children on a path for success in education. When you have success in education, when you have fully supported families, when you have community schools that are able to provide that support, you don't end up having to fund a prison system that has an overrepresentation of incarcerating people of color and people in poverty.
Thank you both. James, you want to take the next one?
Sure. For our state treasurer candidates, how is the constitutional amendment a sound investment for New Mexico taxpayers? And Laura, we'll start with you this time.
Okay. How is the constitutional amendment? I'm sorry, what was the rest of it?
How is the constitutional amendment a sound investment for New Mexico taxpayers?
Anything investing in our children is a sound investment. I was, again, reading the fiscal impact, and I got sort of stuck where people said, well, we would have had this much money if we wouldn't have put money towards these other services prior to this, or in this one, how much money it costs. But I think to my point earlier, better explained, is that if you have a bottom line and you're not factoring in all of the positive impact that it has on single mothers, on families, on crime, on development, on people's excitement for education, then you're not looking at what that real bottom line is. Because in order for New Mexico to stop being on the bottom of every one of our lists that are bad, we need to be able to invest in our children and our families in a much more meaningful way. And this particular joint resolution was even more impactful because they made sure that the services are direct services to our children and to our educators to be able to provide those services. I look at schools in a different light now, even more so than I did before. Recently, I became a foster parent a few months ago, and the school that my godchildren go to is so beautiful, and they were so short on resources, but they use every single little resource that they have to try to help. And then yet they still did more to try to help, like for donations with fire victims in northern New Mexico. I think that we need to start making sure that we're providing enough for our educators to be able to really nourish and nurture our children. And when they're delayed in first grade or kindergarten, 1 or 2 grades, that completely impacts them for the rest of their little careers up to high school and even further. And as a godmother and an auntie of 21 nephews and nieces that call me auntie, I always enjoy teaching the colors and the numbers and all those fun things, but I never played the role of the mom where they're trying to juggle work and life, life situations and not have enough support with the schooling or educational aspect. This money that would come and filter into these direct services would be able to help those families where they're really trying to just make ends meet all the way around. And these wraparound services really will help us with our bottom line in being able to nurture our state, have better resources, keep our resources, the most number one resource, which is our children, to be able to be here in New Mexico, work here, provide for here. As far as with the treasurer's office, I know the state treasurer's office cannot invest the same way that the state investment council can invest. They can't invest in high risk investment portfolios, but what they can, oh, time is up. Sorry. I didn't see the sticker. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We could just keep an eye on that. And could you please put another 20 seconds on for Heather, Paul?
Sure.
Heather, would you like for me to read the question to you?
If you wouldn't mind, thank you.
Sure. How is the constitutional amendment a sound investment for New Mexico taxpayers?
It's a sound investment for the New Mexico taxpayer, I think in 2 very clear and relatable ways. And the educational component, first of all, raising graduation rates, keeping our children out of the criminal justice system that I know as a former judge and having worked in the judiciary for many years, once they're in, it is so difficult to get out. And, it encompasses many costs of its own, but the criminal justice system is the court, and the court costs money, and that filters down and comes, frankly, out of the taxpayer's wallet. And that's all of you, that's all of us, that's every New Mexican. And so giving our children hope through education, making sure that they've got opportunities, like 25 years ago, the lottery scholarship, which, our great Senator Michael Sanchez helped to bring to the stage, things like that this constitutional amendment opportunities will create is really important. And the other is, with education, comes employment opportunities. And we know that, people who are employed are buying things and they contribute to the economy, and they stay employed. And so we don't have to worry about the rising costs of people receiving unemployment. And these are long-term effects of this constitutional amendment. But I think that those are 2 ways that we can look at this and say, keeping people out of the court system and costing the taxpayer money there, keeping people employed so that unemployment benefits aren't being used and abused or overused, and they're there when people need them. But, if we provide opportunities for our youth, so that they don't have to worry about being unemployed or doing things that might put them in a desperate situation, then I think that we can all be in favor of that. And, investing in our future, investing in our people, starting with our children is always good policy. And I am very proud to have the endorsement of several of the co-sponsors, Senators Padilla, Ortiz Pino, Lopez, and Duhigg, as well as Representatives Gail Chasey, former Representative Brittany Barreras, Representative Patricia Roybal Caballero, Representative Christina Ortez, Representative Damon Eli, and Representative Dixon. I'm very proud to have all of those endorsements and proud that they're a part of this because I fully support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Eric.
Okay. Before we go to audience questions, we wanted to ask a question of our two state auditor candidates. And I think, again, both of you have touched on this, but one of the criticisms we've heard is, okay, this is a lot of money, and as Democrats, sometimes we're held to a different standard. So how will you, as state auditor, ensure that the funding generated by this constitutional amendment, which is significant, is used both effectively and transparently? So we'll start with Zach Quintero.
All right, can you all hear me? Good. Thank you, Dr. Griego Montoya. So how we get it effectively and transparently done is having a designated plan and a legislative liaison officer that works with both the Treasurer Department and the State Auditor's Office. OSA is the acronym for the Office of the State Auditor. Having designated funding and a software tracking system that shows the public how the money's being used in real time is going to be critical for that. That's the plan that I'm bringing. That's why I want to make sure that we pull together both the Office of Government Accountability along with our forensic auditing team on issues of anything involving early childhood education, especially hitting that 0.75 to 5% legal requirement. It is a statutory requirement. If this goes into effect, that means we have our baseline legal bar. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at those baseline bars and what the Republicans are going to be attacking us on continually, which is the same time old argument that government only gets in the way, our duty is going to show government can be effective and it can make solid investments and it can make structural changes to the way that we experience society, to the way our criminal justice system works, to getting early childhood education funded, and being able to show that government can be a force for good. That's the story that the State Auditor's Office can tell, and it can do so responsibly by building in these safeguards within the Office of the State Auditor early on. That's what I'll be bringing on day one, having a designated plan already in place and working with key groups and community organizers and champions on this issue, including the legislators that are supporting our effort, and also the legislators across the board from any corner of the state that are supporting this effort, that want to be able to have a transparent conversation of what this money is going to be appropriated towards. I'm going to be interested in looking at different contract service spending farmed out by the state or done by different governmental entities, especially the early childhood education department. I was there with the governor's department when they were drafting that and looked through the fiscal impact reports continuously, because it was my job to track the FIRs in the executive branch for that specific legislative session. So I'm very familiar with that and what the actual financial consequences are. So I appreciate the question. That's how we get it done. Those are the details. And I hope to be able to work closely with everybody here on this issue.
Thank you, Zach. Joseph Maestas, same question.
Thank you, Eric. Being an elected official for almost 16 years now, I've presided over the development and approval of over 15 annual budgets. And what a budget does, it communicates the priorities of that governing body and that particular public entity. And so this new department, this early childhood department, is going to be no different, but it's going to be new. And I believe the next state auditor has to ensure that that there's transparency from the budget standpoint. As mayor of Espanola, I was the first mayor to post my budget online so that all the citizens can see where their money is going to be spent, and it communicates priorities. In terms of accountability, obviously this new department is going to be subject to an annual audit that's going to be overseen by the state auditor. But instead of waiting to see how things unfold by this new department in terms of how they're going to obligate and allocate this money, I think the state auditor really needs to be proactive in building the capacity within, especially financial staff within the early childhood care department, to ensure they have the necessary internal controls to spend this money wisely. And I'm going to promote the use of tried and true practices that help to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, like having internal auditors, like creating an inspector general position Agencies like the New Mexico Department of Transportation has an inspector general. That's an office that pays for itself. Dr. Griego, you championed the creation of an IG in the city of Albuquerque. And so I'm going to work with this department to build capacity on a proactive basis to ensure this money is being spent in a proactive and transparent manner.
Thank you both very much for your thoughtful responses, and all of the candidates for your very deep dive on this issue. And I'm going to turn it back over to Flora now so we can get into hopefully some audience questions.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And once again, yeah, thanks to all the candidates. We don't have any questions in the chat, so I am going to ask my question that I asked of the CD2 candidates, and that is, what is racial equity, racial inequity to you, and how does that impact the position that you're seeking? And so let's start with Joseph. Well, let's work our way back for a little something different. Mr. Maestas, and let's give him 90 seconds on this, please, Paul.
Thank you for the question, Flora. You know, as a person of color, I was one of those college students that when I graduated from UNM with my degree in engineering, a lot of the private sector jobs dried up. So I went to go work for the federal government, and I left the state. And I was in areas that were, you know, not very friendly to people of color. And so I've been on the receiving end of stinging racism. I've seen the disparities everywhere in the workplace, in how money is allocated, how impoverished areas continue to be neglected. And so, you know, racism and the lack of equity it's a disease here in our country. And unfortunately, it's based on skin color and demographic standing or socioeconomic standing. And so I'm going to carry that lens and that perspective with me to ensure that we do carry out these programs with full equity and consideration, and target areas and populations that are in the most need. I just spent 2 days up in Shiprock, and the disparities in the condition of the people of the Navajo Nation, it's atrocious, and we should not stand for it. And so the status quo is not working when it comes to equity and the distribution of money and resources. And I think it needs to start right here with statewide elected officials and other leaders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maestas. And Mr. Quintero.
Gracias, Madam Chair, and thank you, fellow Democrats. Again, Dr. Griego Montoya, Senor Jimenez, thank you so much for hosting us tonight. This conversation truly is about equity at the end of the day for all of us as Democrats. And that's why I prioritize that. Literally, when you go to my website, it says equity and justice. That's what I'm running on. And I'm doing it from a systemic roundup from the community up forward, because of what I've seen in my life, both with direct racism towards my family, towards me, but also the health inequalities that I've seen my grandfather go through. He's the victim of a predatory guardianship. It's a World War II veteran that had his entire VA benefits stripped away from him. And a large part of that was the fact that, but he only spoke Spanish in some circumstances. You know, being targeted and having that kind of specific target on your back for just a healthcare purpose, getting basic dignity through your government and not being able to get that reprieve, that means something to me personally. And that's why I made sure to have a designated plan built on equity. This office of the state auditor can lead completely in it, and it's building from a strong foundation already in place of being a great equalizer to showing what we do with state funds, to showing how we invest our money in real time, and to holding people accountable when they abuse that trust. That's what I'm going to be bringing. That's what I want to be able to focus on. And I'm going to be doing it by having a combined approach, both with the Office of Government Accountability, the Special Investigations Unit, and having a Chief Equity Officer to review the total net spending we do as the state of New Mexico, how many out-of-state contracts we have going out of state with companies that are not great on issues of both, that have a historic pattern and practice, I should say, of racism, sexism, gender wage discrimination, LGBTQ discrimination, and hate. I want to make sure we root our money out from those companies and keep it here in New Mexico honorably and responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quintero. And now, Ms. Benavides.
Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, racial inequity, racial equity, what is it to you and how do you see it playing out in the office that you're seeking?
That's a really great question. And I'm going to speak honestly about it. As the mother of a Hispanic daughter and as the aunt of 12 nieces and nephews, all of whom are persons of color, this is something that is very important to me. And it's obviously something that is very important to Democrats and, you know, all New Mexicans, I would hope. And, you know, student loan debt, first of all, is disproportionately majority held by persons of color. And that's hurting our economy. It is hurting the people who have put themselves through college to try to better themselves. And now they have jobs wherein they can barely pay their bills because their student loan debt is so high. It's specific to the resolution, you know, starting these programs early and making sure that all of our children have access to the education that they need. And, you know, so maybe they can get scholarships, and then in conjunction with the opportunity scholarship and the lottery scholarship, if they stay in state, there will just be better outcomes so that when they do graduate, they aren't saddled with debt, so that they can move on to careers and start their lives and not have to worry about those things. And, you know, specific to the state treasurer's office, what we can do is make sure that we're prudently investing and protecting the state's money and making sure that we are solvent as we move into the future, so that we can support these resolutions and we can support legislation that helps to continue to invest in our children. And specific to this resolution, you know, I read one of the, I'm sorry, I'm just going to finish with this because I think it's really important. One of the bullet points, it says it increases the quality of compensation to early childhood educators who are a majority women of color. And so they do such an important job by taking care of our children, and they should be compensated accordingly. And so thank you for that question.
Thank you. And Ms. Montoya.
Racial equity means to me that when the color of my skin or the gender of my body does not dictate or is no longer a factor to determine who I am. And that's where it has to start. Personal attacks on people's character has always happened to people of color. Questioning whether or not they have the skill set, even when they have a track record, has always been a problem. Having people who have the power and the money and the resources to be able to dictate the perception of your individual character has always been a problem in our history. And sometimes we as individuals, as Democrats, as women, do not stand up for that inequity. And we need to continue to do that. As the youngest elected woman in New Mexico as a county treasurer, and one of the youngest in the state of New Mexico, there has always been inequities. I mean, I was asked to go grab the coffee for people when I was vice chair of finance, pension, and intergovernmental affairs, not offered a seat at the table. I earned that seat at the table. Every single job that I've had, including managing billions of dollars on behalf of taxpayers. And yet still today, it is questioned with my 4 clean audits, managing billions of dollars, whether or not I have the skill set, not because of the quality of my track record, but the color of my skin and my age, and that I'm a woman. And we need to stop that. We need to say, shame on you. It's not okay. Look at the track record, look at the qualifications, look at the results, and get things done for New Mexicans.
Thank you, Laura. So we have a question for the Attorney General's candidates from Rosella Gonzalez, and that is, assuming this passes, what backlash do you expect, and how do we tighten security at our preschool settings? And we'll start this with Mr. Colon.
Thank you, Flor. I do assume this is going to pass, and I think that the people leading the charge are really going to be effective at making that happen. And so it's a good assumption. I'm a little confused on the question In terms of backlash, I remember the yes on 1 and 2 vote, and I remember that effort that really the Democratic Party led the charge, and that was to set up and establish funding for a tier system for our educators to increase compensation and to start the work in the area that we're finishing out with this amendment. And there wasn't a lot of backlash. The second part of the question, so I'm not sure what backlash on the passage that we'll have, but as to the second part of the question, how do we tighten security in our preschool settings? Look, I think I always think we're primed for a conversation about this issue. Today is a very heavy day for all of us when we can think about that we have 14, 16 students, an educator, a grandmother whose lives were taken by an 18-year-old. I think we have to really have substantive conversations about investing resources in the schools for public safety. I just finished speaking with another Democratic group right before I got here, and I talked about and said, look, we have to have candid conversations about trying to find solutions for our schools that strike that balance of having students still feel like students, but have safety measures and still not feel like they're walking into a prison. The Republicans are going to start talking about things like educators having guns. Look, my wife has been on lockdown several times as an educator. She's had more than a couple of occasions where a middle school student has brought a gun to school, and she's had to text me that she's in those circumstances. So I'm ready to have conversations about protecting our students, whether it's with metal detectors and having public safety officers in the schools, but we've got to have that conversation now. We can no longer wait and be scared to have it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colon and Mr. Torres, and you'll have, let's see, 100 seconds.
Well, you know, I think today's tragic news out of Texas just reinforces the urgency of all of us, not just Democrats, but as Americans, to finally come to grips with the scourge of gun violence in this country and the way in which it impacts young people. I don't know if the passage of this amendment will prompt a particular backlash that would inspire, you know, a right-wing extremist or some other person who is suffering from a mental illness. But the real problem is providing the right kind of balance so that kids can feel free to go to school, so that parents can feel comfortable, and so that fundamentally they can be free of fear, not only in their schools, but in their communities. And we have a lot of work left to do in that regard. You know, my mom spent most of her career as a public school teacher, and you know, there was always a difficult balance to be struck there, because it always seemed to her that it was the kids that were in lower income schools that had that ever present sort of heavy-handedness of law enforcement that was there, and that too can have an adverse impact. So it's going to be a very delicate and difficult thing for us to try and make sure that our students are safe and that our educators are safe, but also just to provide the kind of safety that we need. And what we really though need to do is to fundamentally understand who is accessing the weapons and the guns. We have way too many guns on the streets of this country and of this state, where people without regulation and without oversight can get their hands on a weapon and cause just extraordinary harm and chaos and carnage in our community. And we have a long way to go. We have a long way in terms of not just passing legislation, but providing the necessary resources to make sure that enforcement is there, and that we make sure that we've done everything that we can to take the guns out of the hands of people with criminal histories and behavioral health or mental health issues. And if, you know, this is going to be a very difficult road and a hard journey for us all, but it's something I've been committed to and will remain committed to as Attorney General.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our candidates for joining us tonight. Sure appreciate you taking the time to be with us here. We are so lucky that we have you seeking office, and we look forward to whoever it is that wins. We're going to be behind you 100%, and we're looking forward to June 7th to find out who that is. Everybody make sure that you vote. It early voting is open now. So glad to hear that and be a part of that. Want to especially thank Mr. Eric Griego Montoya for your tireless efforts for being here, for championing this cause, as well as Mr. James Jimenez. We are a better state because you are here and you are working on our behalf. Thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. Appreciate each and every one of you. Have a wonderful night, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.